A quarter-acre titled island in a Nicaraguan lake, 10 minutes by boat from a colonial city, with solar power and internet already installed, recently sold for $74,000. That's genuinely less than a lot of cars cost. And yet the standard industry guidance for anyone actually buying a private island is to budget roughly 1.8 times the listing price on top of it, just to make an undeveloped island livable. Before you buy an island, here's what nobody tells you. The price you see on the listing is almost never the number that determines whether this purchase makes sense. It's the multiplier sitting quietly behind it, the cost of power, water, access, and staffing that turns a bargain into a very different financial commitment, and the legal structure of what you're actually buying, which in a huge share of the world's most desirable island markets isn't full ownership at all. By the time this is over, you're going to understand exactly why. Let's talk about what buying an island actually means before we discuss money, because the legal reality varies dramatically depending on where in the world you're looking. In places like the Bahamas, Belize, Panama, and coastal Canada, foreign buyers can typically acquire full freehold title, permanent, transferable ownership of the land itself, the same basic structure as buying a house. But across huge parts of the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, most notably Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, foreign nationals frequently cannot hold freehold title to land at all. What's actually for sale in those markets is leasehold, the right to occupy and use the island for a fixed term, commonly 25 to 99 years, while the underlying land remains owned by a private landowner, a company, or the state. That distinction isn't a minor legal footnote. Industry analysis puts the value gap between holding a title outright and holding a lease at up to 60%, meaning two islands that look nearly identical in size, location, and photos can carry wildly different real value, depending purely on which type of paperwork comes with the sale. Here is where the range is genuinely enormous, spanning from something close to an impulse purchase to a genuine nine-figure trophy asset. At the very bottom, small lake or coastal islands in places like Nova Scotia regularly list under $100,000, sometimes including an existing cottage, dock, and boathouse, though usable only part of the year given the climate. Freshwater titled islands in developing markets, like the Nicaraguan example, can come in even lower, under $100,000. Fully freehold, with basic infrastructure already installed. Move into warmer, more established Caribbean and Central American markets, and turnkey freehold islands, genuinely developed, ready to use, start appearing around the $1 million mark. At the top of the market, islands in premium North American locations command dramatically more. A private island in the Florida Keys recently sold for $95 million, and the broader top end of the global market stretches past $100 million for the most exclusive, most developed properties on Earth. Here's the part that catches almost every first-time buyer off guard. That listing price is genuinely just the beginning. Standard guidance in the industry calls for budgeting roughly 1.8 times the purchase price on top of an undeveloped island to bring in power, water, and basic habitability, or around 1.2 times on top of an already developed one. On top of that, plan for somewhere between $85,000 and $310,000 a year in ongoing operating costs every single year, regardless of how often you actually visit. So you've found your island, confirmed the title, and technically, you're now negotiating to buy it. Before the deal even closes, you have a set of problems that a normal real estate transaction simply doesn't have. The first problem is that a meaningful portion of what looks like your island might not be for sale at all. In markets like the Bahamas, a share of any given K can be designated crown land, government-owned land that isn't included in the transaction, sometimes carved out specifically for a future nature preserve or public access, regardless of how the rest of the island is marketed to you. The second problem is that financing barely exists in this market. Private islands are overwhelmingly a cash buyer's game. Traditional mortgage lenders have little appetite for an asset this illiquid and this specialized, which means most buyers need the full purchase price, plus their development budget, sitting in cash before they even start seriously negotiating. The third problem is that due diligence on an island takes genuinely longer than a normal property purchase, often well over a year. Title history, maritime boundary questions, and environmental review all move slower on remote land than they do on a mainland lot, and a single environmental assessment flag can halt development plans you've already budgeted around. The fourth problem is that leasehold value doesn't just sit flat, it actively erodes. As a lease term shortens year after year, the pool of interested future buyers shrinks along with it, since fewer buyers want to inherit a rapidly diminishing number of years left on the clock, which quietly undermines resale value in exactly the markets, Thailand and Indonesia among them, where the entry price looked most attractive in the first place. Let's say you've closed on the island, built out power and water, and technically, you're an owner. Now let's see what it costs every year just to keep it that way, regardless of how much time you actually spend there. That $85,000 to $310,000 annual range covers the basics. Most people never budget for going in. Fuel or solar maintenance for power generation, water system upkeep, insurance for a genuinely hard-to-insure asset, staffing if the island needs any kind of caretaker presence when you're not there, and the boat or logistics cost of simply getting people and supplies to and from a piece of land surrounded by water. And this is the part that quietly separates a manageable purchase from a financial trap. Those costs don't meaningfully shrink if you visit less often. An island you visit for 3 weeks a year still needs its systems maintained, its structures protected from weather and salt air, and often its caretaker paid for all 52 weeks, whether you're there or not. Here is where owning an island gets genuinely interesting, because the single biggest factor in whether a purchase turns out to be a good decision has almost nothing to do with the island itself. The beach, the view, the size, and almost everything to do with a legal structure most buyers barely think about until they're deep into the paperwork. A freehold island in the Bahamas and a leasehold island in Thailand can list for similar prices and look nearly identical in photos, but one of them is an asset you or your heirs will own indefinitely. The other is a countdown clock, a fixed number of years of use, after which the land reverts to its original owner, regardless of how much you've invested in developing it in the meantime, unless the lease happens to include a renewal option, and that option gets successfully exercised. The crazy part is that up to 60% value gap between title types means the cheaper island on paper can easily be the worst financial decision once you account for what you're actually left holding at the end of the lease term. A buyer chasing the lowest entry price across freehold and leasehold markets without weighing that difference isn't comparing two versions of the same purchase. They're comparing a permanent asset against a very long, very expensive vacation rental with extra steps. There are really two types of people who end up owning islands, and their long-term outcomes look almost nothing alike. The first is the price-driven buyer, someone chasing the lowest possible entry cost, wherever in the world that happens to be, often ending up in leasehold-only markets specifically because the sticker price looks so much more attractive than freehold alternatives elsewhere. This buyer gets the island experience faster and cheaper upfront, but is quietly building toward a lease term that will eventually run out, with resale value working against them the whole way there. The second is the structure-first buyer, someone who treats freehold versus leasehold as the primary filter before location, size, or price, and is willing to pay more upfront or search longer to secure permanent title. This buyer's total cost of entry is higher, but they're building an asset that can genuinely appreciate, get passed down, or be sold decades later without a shrinking lease term working against every negotiation. Let's run the numbers on two $400,000 island purchases. Same budget, same general region, different title structures. While talking about the freehold scenario, the buyer secures full title on a smaller, less developed island for their $400,000, budgets the standard 1.8 multiplier for infrastructure, and spends roughly $720,000 total getting it livable. 20 years later, even accounting for ongoing annual costs the whole way through, the underlying land itself has appreciated the way freehold coastal property generally does, and the owner holds a genuinely sellable, inheritable asset whenever they choose to exit. And in leasehold scenario, the buyer gets meaningfully more island, more square footage, better existing infrastructure for that same $400,000 because leasehold entry prices run structurally lower. They spend less on development since more is already built and enjoy a larger, more comfortable property for the first 15 to 20 years. But by year 20, with the original lease term now more than halfway spent, the remaining years left on the clock are worth measurably less to any future buyer, and financing or reselling that shrinking lease becomes progressively harder exactly when the original buyer might want to exit. The bigger, cheaper-looking island bought on day one becomes the harder, less valuable asset to unwind decades later. Same budget both times. Completely different asset sitting at the end of it. Owning an island is not primarily a question of finding the right beach at the right price. It's a legal structure decision wearing a real estate listing, where two properties that look almost identical in photos can represent permanently different financial outcomes depending entirely on the paperwork behind them. The $74,000 freehold Lake Island and the $100 million freehold trophy property are the same underlying bet at wildly different scales. That the land itself, not just the years you're licensed to use it, is genuinely yours, before a shrinking lease term or an unbudgeted crown land carve-out quietly redefines what you actually bought. For the buyer who treats title type as the first question, not an afterthought discovered during due diligence, an island can be one of the rarest, most genuinely appreciating assets available. For the buyer chasing the lowest sticker price across every market at once, it's an expensive way to discover that the cheapest island on the list was often cheapest for a very specific, very structural reason.